You walk into a room full of people. There is a coffee stain on your shirt, right in the middle of your chest, about the size of a coin. Your heart starts pounding. It feels like every single pair of eyes in the room has already found it. It feels like the entire evening is now going to be about that stain. You sit down at an angle, keep your arm close to your chest, and think about nothing else for the next hour. Later that night, you'll also replay the awkward thing you said to someone by the door, and the way your laugh sounded strange when a joke didn't land. 3 separate sources of anxiety in one evening, and each one feels like the whole room is fixed on it. But the real answer is far stranger. Almost none of those people ever noticed the stain, and the few who did will forget about it before you even get home. This is called the spotlight effect, and it runs your life far more often than you think. Start with a simple question. How many times this past week were you convinced someone noticed your awkward sentence? Your strange walk, your forced laugh, your slip of the tongue on a call? Now, a harder question. How many times can you actually recall someone else's awkward sentence, strange walk, or forced laugh? The gap is enormous, isn't it? Your brain stores your own mistakes in painful detail, down to the tone of voice and the exact look on someone's face in that second. Other people's mistakes get erased almost instantly. And that is where the real story begins. In the late 90s, psychologist Thomas Gilovich asked a question that sounded almost childish. How much do people overestimate how much others notice about them? Gilovich worked at Cornell University, alongside his colleague Kenneth Savitsky. Together, they designed an experiment that gets cited in hundreds of social psychology textbooks today. They asked a student to put on a t-shirt, not just any t-shirt, a shirt with a large image of Barry Manilow printed across the chest. For anyone who missed the 90s, this was about as embarrassing an image as a college student could be caught wearing in public at the time. The student was sent into a room full of strangers for a few minutes, then pulled aside and asked one question. How many people in that room do you think noticed the shirt? The average answer was close to half the room. The real number confirmed by asking the people actually in the room. Less than a quarter. Nearly double the estimate. But the researchers didn't stop there. What if this was just about shame, and not about standing out in general? They ran the experiment again, this time giving students a shirt they could actually be proud of, a shirt with a respected musician or a positive slogan on it. Logic suggests that if someone wants to make a good impression, they judge the audience's attention more accurately. But the result was identical. People overestimated how many others would notice, both the embarrassing detail and the flattering one, by roughly the same margin. So it isn't really about shame. It is about being noticed at all, regardless of whether the attention would be good or bad. Gilovich and Savitsky called this the spotlight effect. The idea is simple. You are the main character inside your own head. You experience the world from the center of your own stage. So you automatically assume everyone else sees you the same way, as the center of their attention, but they have their own stage, and the main character on that stage is themselves. It is worth pausing here to unpack what is actually happening in your head, in the middle of an awkward moment. Why does the spotlight feel so real? The answer connects to another finding from the same researchers, the illusion of transparency. Back in the late 80s, Gilovich, working with Savitsky and another colleague, Kenneth Medvec, showed that when you feel a strong emotion, embarrassment, anxiety, irritation, it feels like that emotion is written all over your face, like you are a window with no curtains. In one version of their experiment, people were asked to taste a truly disgusting drink while keeping a neutral expression. The participants themselves were convinced that onlookers would easily see through them. On average, they guessed that about half the observers would catch their disgust. The observers, overwhelmingly, noticed nothing unusual at all. Your internal storm almost never leaks out as visibly as it feels from the inside. In another version of the same line of research, people were asked to lie during a conversation, then rate how obvious their lie had been. Liars consistently believed they'd been caught far more often than they actually had. This feeling of inner transparency turned out to be a universal mechanism, not just a side effect of embarrassment over a coffee stain. Put those two findings together, and you get a double effect. First, you overestimate how many people are even looking your way. Second, you overestimate how clearly they can read your inner state, even if they do glance over. The spotlight ends up twice as bright as it actually is. So why is your brain wired this crooked in the first place? Wouldn't it make more sense to see the situation objectively? This is where it helps to dig a little deeper into the architecture of attention itself. Back in 1975, psychologist Alan Feinstein, Michael Shire, And Arnold Bust developed a scale to measure something they called self-consciousness. They split it into two types. Public self-consciousness, how preoccupied you are with how others perceive you. Private self-consciousness, how focused you are on your own inner thoughts and sensations. It turned out that in most people, these two dials run together, and both run far higher than you'd expect. You almost never fully switch off the internal observer watching yourself. It switches on when you step into an elevator with a stranger. It switches on when you speak on a video call with the camera running. It switches on even when, objectively, absolutely no one is watching, simply because the possibility of being seen is enough to trigger the spotlight on its own. Notice how physically this shows up. You smooth your hair in front of a glass door a second before you even need to walk through it. Your voice shifts slightly the moment you feel eyes on you in a meeting room. That is public self-consciousness running in real time. A mechanism constantly asking, how do I look from the outside right now? A question so familiar you've long since stopped noticing you are even asking it. This isn't a glitch. It is most likely the legacy of a much older system. Think about how your ancestors lived tens of thousands of years ago. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar was among the first to calculate the typical size of a human social group in pre-literate societies. A number that now carries his name, around 150 people. A small group where everyone was visible to everyone else. Essentially all the time, with no way to disappear into a crowd or vanish among strangers. Reputation in a group like that wasn't an abstraction. If you were seen as unreliable, weak, or strange, you got shared with less often, defended less often in a conflict, chosen less often as an ally for a hunt or a marriage. Social evaluation was a matter of survival in the most literal sense, not just a matter of comfort. So a brain that watched its own image in the group's eyes a little too closely gained a real evolutionary edge over a brain that didn't bother at all. Hypersensitivity to being watched wasn't anxiety in the modern sense. It was an early warning system, better to over-monitor other people's attention just in case than to miss the one moment your standing had already started to slip. In a group like that, there were no records, no ratings, no ratings. The only currency of reputation was conversation. Who said what about whom? Which story got passed around the fire? Evolutionary psychologists describe this as indirect reciprocity. You help the person others speak well of, and avoid the one whose reputation has soured, even without ever crossing paths with them. A brain that once missed its own public misstep risked not learning about its falling status in time, and therefore not fixing it while there was still a chance. The problem is that this mechanism was calibrated for a group of about 150 people who genuinely knew you well and genuinely tracked your reputation for years. Today, you walk into a room of casual acquaintances, and that ancient alarm system reacts as if you were standing before your small tribe again, with your survival hanging on their verdict. The brain never got the update. It is still running a tool built for tiny, tightly bound groups inside a world full of indifferent strangers. You'll likely see only once in your life. There is an age when this mechanism runs at full volume. Back in 1967, developmental psychologist David Elkind described a phenomenon he called the imaginary audience. He noticed that teenagers, at a certain stage of development, genuinely behave as if an invisible crowd is constantly watching their every move, every detail of their clothing, every shift in mood. Elkind linked this to the fact that the teenage brain is still learning to separate its own point of view from everyone else's. A skill that is usually automatic in adults, but never fully disappears. That is exactly why a single pimple on the forehead can feel capable of ruining an entire week of school. Adults don't lose this imaginary audience completely as they grow up. It just gets quieter. But under stress, in unfamiliar company, in front of a camera, it switches back on almost at teenage volume. That is exactly why an adult who is completely at ease in a real conversation can suddenly feel a primal dread at the thought of turning on a webcam and recording a simple video. Elkind's imaginary audience doesn't ask how old you are. It reacts to the sheer possibility of being seen by many people at once. And now for a genuinely unexpected twist. Even when someone does notice your awkward moment, how long that information survives in their head is almost laughably short. In that same series of experiments, Gilovich and his colleagues measured not just the initial perception, but what happened days later. It turned out that observers who did notice the mistake, the bad answer, the strange remark, that same Barry Manilow shirt, forgot about it noticeably faster than the participant assumed they would. Someone else's awkward moment simply isn't important enough to their brain to stick around for long. That person has their own worries, their own internal spotlight, pointed entirely at themselves. Psychologist Nicholas Epley and his colleagues took this even further, showing the same bias applies not just to appearance but to words. People consistently overestimate how closely others analyze their slip-ups and awkward phrasing in conversation. It feels like your verbal stumble will be dissected and remembered, when in reality, the other person had already moved on within a minute, thinking about what to say next. Take a second to notice something. Right now, you almost certainly have a memory or two from your past. An awkward line at a party, a dumb question in a job interview, that you can recall with almost cinematic precision years later. Now try to remember a single awkward moment that happened not to you, but to the person standing next to you that same day. Chances are, you can't remember anything at all. Not because you are unobservant, but because someone else's stumble never made it into your own spotlight, just as your stumbles almost never truly made it into the spotlight of most people around you. The mechanism runs symmetrically. It is just only ever noticed in one direction. The modern world doesn't just fail to cure this effect. It amplifies it more than anything in human history. In the past, your spotlight only existed inside one room for one evening, and it went dark along with the lights in that room. Today you post a photo, and part of you instantly starts imagining every single follower scrutinizing it, hunting for flaws, forming a permanent opinion, remembering it forever. You check the number of likes not because you actually care about the statistic itself. You check because that ancient reputation tracking mechanism, built for a small tribe, is now trying to process hundreds or thousands of potential observers at once, and it can't handle that volume because it was never built for it. Worse, the digital trace never disappears. In an ancient tribe, an awkward moment dissolved from people's memory within days. Today, a photo or a message can technically exist forever. And part of your brain understands this perfectly well, which is where the feeling comes from that any mistake becomes a permanent piece of evidence, available to an endless stream of future observers. The spotlight simply never turns off. Think about how many times you've deleted a post within minutes of publishing it because the comments didn't come in as fast as you'd hoped. Or reread your own message 3 times before hitting send. Or froze right before turning on the camera for a call, imagining that every participant was studying the background behind you. None of those people are actually spending a tenth of the attention on you that you are assigning yourself in that moment. Does that mean your awkwardness never matters to anyone at all? Not quite. Does it mean it matters to a far smaller number of people for a far shorter amount of time than your anxiety suggests? Almost always yes. There is a harsher flip side to this same fact. The same mechanism applies to your achievements too. A new haircut, a win at work, a joke you were proud of all day. All of it gets noticed by far fewer people than it feels like the moment you walk out the door or hit publish. That is rough to hear, but hidden in that same roughness is a kind of relief. If no one is watching you as closely as the anxiety insists, the cost of a possible mistake is also far lower than it feels from the inside. The spotlight blinds you in both directions. Either way, most of the room is looking at their phone. So what can you actually do with this? Knowing about the spotlight effect doesn't switch it off completely on its own. It is too ancient a mechanism to vanish just because you read an article or watched a video about it. But the knowledge is still useful. In the moment anxiety insists that everyone is staring right at you, you can ask yourself one simple question. What did I actually notice about other people in the last hour? Chances are, almost nothing specific. You were too busy running your own spotlight to point it at anyone else. And the person standing across from you is going through the exact same thing, mirrored, in that exact same second. There is a second technique many clinical psychologists who work with social anxiety rely on, sometimes called a spotlight audit. Deliberately try to recall how many details you actually retained about other people's day yesterday. What was the cashier at the store wearing? If you can't even remember that, picture how much attention is genuinely left over for the coffee stain that happened in passing at a party, where everyone else's head was already full of their own concerns. It is also worth noting the spotlight effect doesn't run at the same intensity in every situation. It is almost always weaker around close friends, and much stronger around strangers or casual coworkers, since strangers have always been the hardest to predict. And predictability is what that ancient risk assessment mechanism cares about most. Which leads to a useful conclusion. If the dread before a presentation or a new social group feels unbearable, that isn't a sign the situation is genuinely dangerous. It is a sign you are dealing with a situation the ancient mechanism has the least data on. Let's go back to where we started. You are standing in a room with the stain on your shirt, the slip of the tongue from the doorway, and the strange laugh that never quite left your mind by the end of the night. It feels like each of those three small things is the center of the entire evening for everyone in the room. In reality, the center of the evening for each of them is themselves, their own hair, their own awkward sentence from 5 minutes ago, their own private list of worries, on which, honestly, there was never any room for you. The spotlight you feel so vividly is only burning inside your own head. Everyone else has the exact same one switched on, pointed at the exact same target as yours, themselves. And tomorrow, when you remember this evening in vivid detail, almost none of them will remember you at all. Not because you don't matter, but because they spent the whole night starring in the exact same production, inside their own heads.